I don't have a gavel, so I'll do this. Oh, wonderful. That's a very attentive audience that bodes well for all of us. Good evening and welcome to you who are sitting here and to all our live streamers. I don't know how many there are of you out there, but welcome. We're glad to have you. Tonight we're going to hear Blue Wave or Red Wedding, a lecture and conversation on trend and Mirage in the 2018 midterm elections. This event is hosted by Project Continuum and Barnard's Athena Center for Leadership Studies. My name is Eileen Fish, and I am a class of 1967 of Barnard and chair of Project Continuum. This is my first year serving as chair, and actually it's my inaugural event, so it's very special for everybody. Thank you. For those of you who are wondering what Project Continuum is, it's a volunteer committee of the Alumni Association of Barnard College. Its mission, or our mission, is to engage alumni who graduated 30 years or more ago to promote dialogue around diverse personal, cultural, political, and professional issues. So it's the best committee that Barnard has. The Athena Center for Leadership Studies, whose acting director is Victoria Gordon, who is here tonight. Victoria, you want to just raise your hand? Thank you. Is pioneering undergraduate women's education dedicated to the advancement of inspired and courageous women leaders around the world. We're very excited to have members of Project Continuum Committee here tonight. Guys, you want to raise your hand if you're a member? Okay, and Dorlyn Pines, who's last year's past chairman. Thank you. As well as representatives from the Athena Center. I don't know if there are people from the Athena Center, but if you are, raise your hands. Thank you for helping us to put this event together and for everything you do for Barnard. In addition, I want to remind all you wonderful Barnard people, alums, friends, that Barnard's Giving Day is on Wednesday, October 24th, 2018. We need to really pump up those numbers, so please don't forget. And thank you in advance. The 2018 midterm elections are issues that we all care deeply about, and the Alumni Association is delighted to partner with the Athena Center, as well as our two esteemed speakers this evening. Michael Miller is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Barnard, and Jessica Huseman is an investigative reporter at ProPublica and adjunct professor at Columbia Journalism School, who will critically explore this year's election narrative and discuss varying viewpoints and possible outcomes. To begin our program, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Miller, who many of you know was with us 2 years ago, and we all enjoyed it and came back to hear him again. He's a member of Barnard's Political Science Department and has been since 2014. He holds a PhD from Cornell University and is a scholar of American elections and political behavior, with a particular focus on how people respond to changes in election law. Hopefully they can vote. Prior to joining academia, he was a political strategist and ran a number of campaigns for the U.S. House and Senate. He is the author and co-author of 2 books, Subsidizing Democracy, How Public Funding Changes Elections and How It Can Work in the Future, and Super PAC, Money, Election, and Voters After Citizens United. Numerous book chapters and more than a dozen peer review articles. His work has been covered in a range of media outlets, including MSNBC, C-SPAN, and The Washington Post. Since 2017, he has been a statistician with Fox News Election Night Decision Team. Working with Fox, the Associated Press, and others, Professor Miller has developed a new method for calling elections without the use of exit polls. He and Fox will employ this method for election night calls in 2018. After presenting an overview, Professor Miller will be joined by Jessica Huseman, an investigative reporter for ProPublica, covering national politics and civil rights, and an adjunct professor at Columbia Journalism School. ProPublica is an independent nonprofit newsroom that produces investigative journalism covering a range of topics that include government and politics, business, criminal justice, the environment, and immigration. She is the lead reporter for Electionland, ProPublica's collaborative initiative to help dozens of newsrooms cover the 2018 election. She is also a graduate of the Stable program in investigative journalism at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, where she received the Pulitzer Traveling Fellowship and the Fred M. Heckinger Award for Distinguished Education Reporting. Following the program, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of both of our speakers. We want to thank you again both, Professor Miller and Ms. Huseman, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us this evening, and it's my pleasure now to call Professor Miller to the podium.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be here tonight to talk about the midterm election. As you can imagine, I'm doing a lot of this this season, and I don't really know either, but we'll do our best to try to sort this out. We'll begin with the narrative that we're seeing being covered in the media, which is the metaphorical blue wave. And you know, if you go on Twitter or if you watch just about any news source, you will find folks describing what they expect in the midterm as this impending wave. We have seen wave elections before. I'm not sure that we're going to see one this time in terms of the definition of how we define a wave, but I will use the past to sort of look into the future a little bit before we move on and talk about some of the larger issues at work in this election. So, will we see the blue wave? People like me, rather than going with our partisan instincts, I think, tend to look into the past to try to find out what it can tell us about the future. And that is, what do the historical trends say with respect to how 2018 might play out? And what I can tell you about the state of political science on this question is that midterm elections are absolutely a referendum on the president. That is one thing that is true for every president for which we have good public opinion data going back to Harry Truman, and the result is usually not favorable. The referendum on the president is usually not favorable. We have reached a point in administrations 2 years in where the honeymoon is kind of over, and the saying goes, you campaign in poetry and govern in prose, and Americans very often don't like the prose as much as the poetry. And so they look at the Oval Office and the occupant thereof, and they say to themselves, well, maybe we should do something different. Or alternatively, you might look at the president and say, the president has been too effective. He's given us too much poetry. And so there is a theory in political science that says we temper that, and we have a natural preference for divided government. And so we give one of the houses of Congress to the opposition party in an attempt to rein the president in. So what you're seeing here is a plot of House losses. These are the losses of the president's party going back to 1946 midterm elections. And you can see that in all cases but two, the president does lose seats. And it's very often in the range of 20 seats or less. But it's not, we should not qualify it as uncommon to see losses in the 30 or more range. So when I said earlier that I'm not sure we're going to see a wave election, what I meant is, I called a loss of 50 seats a wave. That's what the data would say, and that's what I'm not sure that we're going to see this time. But if you're laying bets just based on what you've seen, I think you could feel pretty comfortable with a range of right in here based on history alone. We see a same trend in the Senate election. Senate is smaller, so we're not going to see a raw loss, but if you compare plot to plot, you will see that the Senate losses do concentrate in a similar band. It's not atypical for a loss of 5 seats. Average elections, probably 3 to 4, but again, we see instances, particularly on the more recent part of the trend, where presidents are losing 5 to 7 to 8 seats in that midterm. And so if you are not a fan of the president, what I have shown you so far should be making you lean forward in eager anticipation of what I'm about to say with respect to how we can use other data to project into the future. Now, I see students here, and the students know that there's always a Back to the Future joke in my slide deck, and there it was. So beyond just historical trends, let's look at a couple of other things. Things that we think matter. Things that when we look backwards at the data, things that have appeared to be predictive. One of them is the so-called generic ballot. The generic ballot is a public opinion polling question that is asked on almost every poll these days, but has not always historically been asked. So we only have good data on this back to the Clinton era. And the question usually says, if the election was held today, would you vote for the Democrat or Republican for Congress? So we're not asking for any judgment about a particular candidate, but what public opinion pollsters believe is this question gives us a sense of latent partisan feeling that will probably fuel a vote decision, particularly with respect to whether someone turns out or not. And so I've plotted the generic ballot as of October 15th on any given day, or on any given election year, which is the date I made this slide, so I was trying to be as honest as possible in the prediction. And what we see is that there's a gently negative slope here, which is to say that as the out party, the opposite party of the president, does better on that generic ballot. So if 10% of Americans are saying they prefer the other party than what the president is, we would see losses in the Senate of about 2 to 3 seats, something like that. All right, so where are we today on the generic ballot? We're right about there. So the generic ballot, when I made this slide, was about 8 points conservatively. You can go and look on Real Clear Politics or any poll aggregator right now, and you will see estimates for the generic ballot bouncing all over between 6 and 14 points. It has slid in a more Democratic direction just in the 3 days since I've made this slide. I would now characterize it somewhere right about here, but you can see given the slope of this curve, it doesn't really impact that much. So based on generic ballot, we could say we could expect Democrats to pick up, to net 4 to 5 seats in the midterm. A better predictor than generic ballot, even though this is the one that is often talked about on the news, a much better predictor for us, mainly because we have more data points on it, is presidential approval. So looking at the presidential approval rating on October 15th of the election year, I was able to plot this curve. The red dotted line is fitting a line through the data just to guide you. And where are we today? We're at about 42% approval for Donald Trump. So in the Senate then, we have 2 estimates that suggest seat losses for Republicans netting 4 to 5 seats. And that's what we would expect given these available data in a typical year. The problem is, if you're a Democrat, this is not a typical year. Now, I think about elections every single day of my life and have ever since I can remember. And I have never seen a map and never will see a map in my life again that is more hostile to one party than the Democrats face in the Senate midterm election. So you can see of the 33 seats that are up for grabs, 24 of them are held by Democrats, which means that they have to defend all of those, plus win at least 2 of these Republican seats in order to take control of the United States Senate. So if we break down those races that are up for grabs, which I've done here, I think everyone who's looking at the midterm elections right now basically agrees on this characterization of the Senate race. The states shaded in blue are those that we believe are probably going to go back to the Democrats. Those are seats that they hold now, and people will be reelected. The states in dark red are Republican-held seats that they will probably, look, let's just be honest. They're winning these 4 seats. I mean, Mitt Romney is not losing the Utah Senate election. And the black states, they don't have a seat up. The gray states, those are the ones that we have to look at. Now, all of these, anyone who's trying to tell you that they're going to forecast this accurately is hoodwinking you. These are all coin toss races, basically. Some of them we can be more confident than others, and I will share that with you in a second. But if you were going to force me, which I have been done tonight, I have been forced to make a call on this race, using available information about incumbents, demographic shifts in the states, the polling data that are available, if you forced me to make calls, I would do it like this. So shading the map, now we have 4 colors. The light shades are the projections that I'm making. Taking in order from most confident to least. Of all the calls on this map, I'm feeling most confident about Heidi Heitkamp losing in North Dakota. I say this as a native North Dakotan. It's a state that I know well, and everything that I can gather there does not look good for Senator Heitkamp. I'm also feeling pretty confident, actually, in Joe Manchin. Now he's been a candidate that a lot of people have thought of as dangerous, but he did not draw a very strong general election opponent, and he is actually pretty well liked in his home state of West Virginia. I'm also feeling very confident in Tennessee, Blackburn winning in the state of Tennessee. The rest of these, as far as I'm concerned, are pick 'em. I think every bit of polling I've seen in Nevada suggests that Heller is running well there. However, I'm not very confident in this call because Nevada is the most difficult state in America to poll. You should never, ever trust a poll of Nevada for any reason. And the reason for that is because the art of polling is to know who's voting. And we never know who's going to turn out in Nevada because it's such an itinerant population. The state breathes every 2 years. People move out and people move in to work in the service industry, and it's almost impossible to accurately characterize that election. So if on the day after Election Day, Dean Heller has lost, it would surprise me not at all. Texas. Now, Barnard, I know you want Beto. But the lead for Cruz has opened into double digits in most polls. And this is a state that most analysts are not really becoming less and less interested in. I will give you the good news on Beto. The Q3 fundraising report was just recently released, a couple days ago. Beto raised $38 million in 3 months. Now, I am old enough to remember a time when we called $38 million half a presidential election. And so what we decided in my elections seminar this afternoon is that if he loses this race, Beto becomes the Democratic frontrunner for United States president. I'm not being hyperbolic. He will have enough money to run in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina without raising another nickel. And so what do we know about quality candidates? Money talks. And he's got it. So I think he'll land on his feet regardless. If he wins, would I be amazed? Not at all. The one thing that Beto O'Rourke has going for him is we are seeing a surge of voter registration in Texas, unprecedented. But Texas is always a state where I say prove it. It's one of the worst voting states, no offense, Professor. It's one of the worst voting states in America as far as turnout goes. If we had turnout in Texas at parity with Minnesota, for instance, its congressional delegation would be 85% Democratic, and both of its senators would be Democratic as well. So Texas is a turnout game. When the 18 to 29 demographic turns out in Texas, when the Hispanic voting bloc turns out in Texas, I will believe Beto O'Rourke can win, and we won't know that until after the election is over. Missouri. Missouri is a state that Claire McCaskill is the luckiest senator in the Senate. Every time she stands for election, something happens to her benefit, and I think that this is the time when she runs out of luck. Again, would I be amazed to see her win? No. It's a very close election, and she is an incumbent. And in close elections, we should expect the incumbent to win. I have a feeling about that one. Florida's one to watch. I have Bill Nelson holding that for the Democrats. However, the wild card here is Hurricane Michael. Now, Hurricane Michael just hit Florida, and when disasters hit, political science tells us that that's time for executives to shine. which by many accounts Rick Scott is doing in his capacity as governor. I think that will possibly swing votes, so Florida could be closer than I was expecting it to be, which could swing it over to Rick Scott. The consolation prize for you, if you are wanting Nelson to hold that seat, is that the mayor of Tallahassee, Jake Illum, is doing the same thing in his executive capacity as mayor, and I think it's quite possible that on the same ballot you see a Democrat elected governor and a Republican elected Senate. But again, that's a coin toss election as well. Arizona. Arizona is a Democratic pickup, I think. This one I'm actually feeling pretty good about. And that is Kristen Sinema, who has one of the more interesting stories of any candidate in America. She is, to my knowledge, the first openly bisexual candidate elected to the United States House. She lived for 3 years homeless with her family as a child, and she can really tell a story. I think she's one of the party's up-and-coming candidates, along with Tim Walz, who's presently running for governor of Minnesota. They are two people to really watch on the Democratic bench for not 2020, but beyond. So she's a name that I think that you'd want to know. And New Jersey. Now, I'm a resident of New Jersey, and I know that a lot of my neighbors are really really not looking forward to their vote decision in this one. We have a Democratic incumbent who's been accused convincingly in the minds of many of corruption. And the choice that voters will have to make is, do they prefer a Democratic majority or, voting with some kind of moral code? So I don't know what it means when we say New Jersey, do the right thing, but yeah, everyone can make their mind up on that question. I realize now that I left out Indiana. Indiana, I think, is going to go to Donnelly. He's running an excellent campaign, very well tuned, running very strong. But again, if every color on this map on the day after the election is the opposite color, it would not surprise me at all. These elections are truly too close to call. So I'm married to very few of them. These are just my gut calls here. If you're scoring at home, that was a Republican gain of 1 seat is what I'm expecting. A different story emerges, however, in the House race. Now, this is a map of 20 of the congressional districts in 2016. This is their presidential vote. And Donald Trump likes to show this map on the stump. He likes to say that you can drive from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and never set foot on Democratic soil, which is true. But what is interesting about this map, if I'm going to back up one slide, look at these black states and the red. Go black and the red. And what you're going to see there is a lot of Republican territory, which means that the Democratic voters, the voters for the House are different. It's a different electorate. So we have to tell a different story. And where these House districts are going to be the House elections are going to be waged is in the suburbs. And even in some rural areas, I'm looking at Pennsylvania and some parts of Texas. If Beto O'Rourke can turn out voters like he thinks he can, we could be talking about seats in Texas in play as well. Republicans currently have a 238 to 193 majority with 4 vacancies in the House. So Democrats need 25 pickups. That's the magic number here. Let's go back to the data. Generic ballot suggests a steeper curve in House elections, which we might expect because there's more of them. So if you remember what the generic ballot was, we should expect a pickup from the generic ballot prediction of about 21 seats, short of what Democrats need. But remember, the generic ballot is a less reliable predictor of midterm swing than presidential approval. I've again plotted the House gains against presidential approval, and this model puts us somewhere right here. I am feeling quite comfortable, and I want to, if we evened out the predictions between what this one says and what the last one said, I'm feeling quite comfortable predicting Democratic gains of somewhere between 28 and 38 seats in the United States House races. This comports pretty well with Nate Silver's predictions. He's got a much more robust model hanging on this than mine. This is as of 3 days ago. He was giving Democrats the most probable result in his model was a 35 seat swing. This also his model, I should say, incorporates economic fundamentals, which is something that you always want in election projections. 2016 taught us that it's not good enough to just look at aggregated polling. We have got to factor in the economy, which Silver's model does. This also comports quite well with the Cook political report. Now, Cook, they use a lot of gut calls as well as aggregated polling in economics. But one thing that I really like showing here about their aggregation is that this is a very, very bad slide for Republicans because what they have done is color-coded the seats being defended. Now, of the seats that lean Democratic, there are 12 seats that they are characterizing as leaning towards the Democrats. 11 of them are presently owned by Republicans. And we see, as far as the toss-ups go, Republican toss-ups, if this is truly a toss-up, we would expect them to lose half. Well, those are all Republican seats too. So right there, you're already at your 35 number. So if you take the Cook political report and give a probability of 0.75, which is it's actually conservative, 0.75 of the Democrats winning the lean Democratic races, and a 0.5 probability of victory for Democrats in the toss-ups, then the Democrats out of this list net 29 seats, which is also in line with the range that I'm coming up with and gives Democrats a slim majority in the U.S. House. So again, just recapping, 29 to 39 feels very probable, given that it's the number that we keep seeing. But we have to be very careful since 2016 to say that these are probabilistic predictions. And if I tell you that the Democrats have an 80% chance of winning the House, it means that if we have the election 100 times, Republicans will win 20 of those elections, which means if you are a Democratic voter or a Republican voter, do not take this as prophecy. You still have a job to do, which is get out there and vote. These projections are not self-fulfilling. So I encourage everyone to go and vote their conscience on Election Day, because as we know, that blue wave might not materialize. If you are a Game of Thrones fan, you know that the red wedding happens right when everybody gets comfortable. They think the war is over, and then they get an arrow in the back. And so it's important to do your democratic diligence and go and cast your ballot for whatever team you prefer. And may the chips fall. Because, I stood here in 2016 and I said a Clinton win felt probable. And it did. It did feel probable, but that doesn't mean that it was certain. So things have a way of feeling certain until they aren't. One of the things that is increasing the certainty, and one of the things that I want to mention before I transition here, is that we live in an era of we live in interesting times when it comes to election administration. Since the Shelby County decision in 2013, which is the most important Supreme Court decision when it comes to voting rights of any of our lifetimes, we have seen an explosion of, for lack of better description, changes in election administration that have outright disenfranchised people in some states, or at least inconvenienced people in others. And I think that should be factored in as an element of uncertainty in any model that we want to make when it comes to predicting election outcomes. So we have stories from Georgia about the sitting Secretary of State purging voters there. And we have stories in my home state of North Dakota about a crafted election voter ID law where certain kinds of identification known to be lacking among the Native American tribes, which is the Democratic strongholds in North Dakota, was passed. And so folks look at this as an effort to disenfranchise voters. And so I will actually now transition because those efforts at disenfranchisement, they're important. And I'm really happy to be here with Jessica Huseman tonight, because every time I'm with her, I say, and I mean this, that she is this country's best investigative reporter when it comes to voting rights and election administration. And the work that she is doing is more important than anything that I could ever do for the integrity of this democracy. And so I'm looking forward to what she has to say about election administration and voting, and then we can continue the conversation after that. So I would welcome her.
Well, I am flattered, and also not that tall. So, okay. So, I'm Jessica Huseman, and I run Election Land at ProPublica, and I just want to talk for just a bit about what Election Land is and how it influences the way that I view elections and what's about to happen in the midterms. So, Election Land is a collaborative journalism project. We did this in 2016, and it was the largest collaborative journalism project that has taken place on American soil. There were 1,000 journalists working together on that day during 2016, and it's a bit smaller and more streamlined this year, but the principles are the same. So we help local newsrooms across the country cover election administration in real time, and we do that in a couple of different ways. So first, we get a tip, and we have a software that pulls in several sources of data, the biggest one being 888-R-VOTE, which is run by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. It's a hotline of attorneys that operate in the vast majority of states. And you can call if you have an election administration problem, or you believe you've been disenfranchised, or you're having trouble voting, and they will log your complaint into a system, and if necessary, they will help you. Well, we get all of their tips in real time. So we know pretty instantaneously where large problems are happening in election administration across the country. We're also getting emails and tweets and texts from people all over the country, helped by our local reporting partners who are promoting our number to their readers across the country. So right now, we have almost 100 local partners that are working in areas that we anticipate we will see election problems in. So those are very targeted local partners. And so we take these tips in. We do a little bit of investigative work on our own to make sure that they're real tips, that people are actually having problems voting and it's not just a misunderstanding. And once we know that to be true, we send them to our local reporters. And that's very powerful because we can say to them, this problem is happening at this polling location, and we think that you should go there. And we think you should report about it today. Because what happened prior to 2016, prior to Election Land, was that reporters who were covering election administration, if they were covering at all, were just sort of driving around to polling locations and like not really knowing where something was happening. And they'd walk in and they'd be like, anything going on here? And they'd be like, no. And then they just drive away. But now we can say, hey, no, like this poll worker is giving people incorrect instructions for voter ID and is disenfranchising people. Please go to that polling location, shine a light on it, and then what happens inevitably is that it's covered in the news and so it gets fixed, right? This is the power of Election Land. We've already actually seen this happen. We got a tip a couple of days ago that students at Prairie View A&M, which is a historically black university in Waller County, Texas, were being made to essentially re-register to vote because of an administrative error on the part of the county. And so we got that tip, we fed it to the Houston Chronicle, helped them report it out on the back end, and the Texas Secretary of State said, hey, no, they don't have to do that. They should just be allowed to vote as is, which was great. And that is sort of the power of Election Land and reporting in this way. So when we did this in 2016, these are the problems that we saw. By far, the biggest problem we saw was in Texas with the implementation of the voter ID law. It wasn't even the voter ID law itself, and we can talk more about why that's true. But it was the way that the law was implemented was so confusing to people that a majority of the tips that we got from Texas, and actually a plurality of all of our tips, were because people didn't know how to comply with the voter ID law in Texas. And when I say people, I don't just mean voters, I also mean poll workers. It was just very confusing. We saw a few long lines, not nearly as many as we saw in, say, 2012 or 2008. That problem has been largely shored up by election administrators across the country. We saw very isolated incidents of electioneering and voter intimidation. You might remember that Roger Stone, in the days before the 2016 election, said, I'm going to send people to those polling locations. We all knew what he meant when he said that. That never actually happened. And I think Roger Stone knew that the media would carry the water for him. And the threat of intimidation keeps people away, just like actual intimidation does. And so he didn't really need to intimidate voters in order to get people to stay home. And so we're hoping that Election Land tamps down misinformation and raises up actual problems. And we would have considered election intimidation to be not a real problem in 2016, and we didn't report on it. And then there was also confusion over redistricting and where polling places was, and who was supposed to be in what place, and all of that. So I do want to note, right, that we, especially people on the left, and also journalists, tend to be a little self-defeating when it comes to voter suppression, when it comes to moves that are perceived to be direct attempts, and often they are, at disenfranchising voters, and assuming that thousands and thousands of people will be disenfranchised and will change the whole narrative. This is voter turnout over time, and it is basically flat. So it starts here. This is the fancy graph I've created for you this evening. It starts in 1980, goes to 2016. You will notice that it's kind of flat over time, right? We've had huge attempts at voter suppression during this time. It hasn't really moved the needle one way or the other. And I have a couple of things to say about that. So first of all, if voter suppression were a huge indicator, it is an indicator, but if it was a huge indicator in who turned out to vote and who did not, we would anticipate that African Americans would be the lowest racial group in terms of turnout. They are not. Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans turn out at much lower rates than African Americans do. And we would also expect, right, that we would see spikes when things change or when they're repaired, and we don't see that either. So that's not to say that voter suppression isn't bad, and it's not to say that voter suppression does not force people not to turn out, because it does, and we should certainly cover those things. But people tend to be self-defeating when they talk about these things, and I don't think that's healthy for democracy either. So all of that said, Shelby County decision was mentioned, and it is a huge, it's been a really interesting time to be a reporter covering voting rights and election administration. I think that I am actually the only reporter in the country that covers election administration full-time as my beat. Other people cover voting rights and also civil rights, which includes prison reform, et cetera, et cetera. I just cover election administration and voting rights, and so all I've been doing for the last 2 years is sort of dealing with the ramifications of Shelby being overturned. So the most immediate implication of Shelby being overturned was that on the day that Shelby was overturned, Greg Abbott instituted the Texas voter ID law by tweet. So it had previously been held up under pre-clearance, and Shelby County annihilated the formula that pre-clearance was held under. So pre-clearance is still an idea. It's just that all of the states that were previously under pre-clearance are no longer under pre-clearance, and you have to get bailed back in order to be under the system again. So as soon as Texas was released from this system, the voter ID law had already passed in 2013. It was simply held up by this process. The process no longer existed anymore, and so the voter ID law was instantaneously in effect, and it remains in effect today, with the addition of a reasonable impediment declaration, which allows people who have some justifiable reason for not having an ID to sign a form attesting that they are who they say that they are in Texas, and then they also get to vote. But we've also seen more people removed from the rolls. So we mentioned Georgia. So Georgia's exact match program also got held up in pre-clearance, and they are instituting a form of that today. So if you register to vote and your name does not exactly match what is in the Social Security database or what is in the driver's license database, depending on which form of identification you use to register, then your registration is not terminated, but is held up. So I want to make very clear that the people who are in this system in Georgia whose names are pending because their registration could not be immediately confirmed in this exact match process, they can still vote if they go to the polls with an ID that substantially matches what they have registered under. So that's really important to know, but that system also got held up under pre-clearance, and they are not working with the exact system today, but they are working with a substantially similar form of it. And also, you know, purging has gone way up over time, and Georgia is a perfect example of that. The median purge rate increased from 6.7 to 10.7%. That's quite a lot of people. And the Husted decision in Ohio was really important to this. So if you don't vote, Husted said that if you don't vote in 2 or more elections, you get a postcard. And if you don't return that postcard, saying, I am still registered and I live at this address, and then you don't vote in another 2 elections, you can be removed from the rolls. And so Georgia operates under that exact same standard. And so these people who are being removed from the rolls in Georgia are getting notified and are following this standard, but it's still thousands of people. And then you'll remember that I mentioned that now that pre-clearance, the formula for pre-clearance is no longer a thing, now you kind of have to, that process has been restarted. So if states or localities have a history of racially sort of stratifying the choices that they do in their elections, they can be put back under pre-clearance. But this summer, the Supreme Court, essentially in a 5-4 decision on Texas's maps, and Texas has been found to have sort of specifically targeted minorities in 5 separate federal court decisions since Shelby County was overturned. They said, no, we're not putting Texas back under pre-clearance. You have to assume that the legislators are working in good faith, right? And unless there is objective evidence that suggests that they are not working in good faith, then we're not going to put people back under pre-clearance. Well, you know, even in Texas, my home state, right, the legislators are not dumb enough to be like, oh, we're doing this because we don't like brown people, right? And write that somewhere, right? They have all sorts of facially neutral ways that they can have this conversation without overtly talking about race, right? And they do that all the time. So let's take a look at some of these things that have happened. So over the past 2 years, there have been 5 states, Arkansas, Iowa, Missouri, North Dakota, and Texas, that have passed new laws requiring voters to provide identification at the polls, and now 34 states require you to show some form of ID at the poll. And the most sort of recent controversy over this is North Dakota, where their IDs specifically require you to have a street address listed on them, which is specifically difficult for Native populations who do not have traditional street addresses. So they literally cannot get the type of ID that is required under this ID law. And so the workaround for this, if you need an ID and you live on a reservation that does not have a plotted address, is that you have to call your this is true. You have to call your 911 operator. You have to get your address plotted, then take that address and then get a new ID. And that process alone, just getting it plotted, takes about an hour, and then you've got to go get a new ID. So there's a lot happening there. And we're expecting a lot of confusion in North Dakota, one, because that law is difficult to follow if you're a Native American voter, but also because that law was not in place during the primary because it was held up by litigation. But the Supreme Court has decided that it can be in place for the general. And when laws change that rapidly, you see a lot of confusion, not just from people who are negatively impacted by the law as it stands, like Native American voters, but also from just the entire state, right? Because if you change rules on people, and we need to remember that voting is something that most people do once every 4 years, right? Nobody's good at voting. Then you get really confused. So we're going to expect a lot of reports coming in from for election land. So a lot of states have also changed their voter registration requirements. And some states have changed this to open up voting. Some states have changed this to close down voting. Either way, we expect confusion because anytime laws change, we expect confusion. So automatic voter registration was implemented in 7 states, Alaska, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Rhode Island, and Vermont, and the District of Columbia also. And this will be the first year that that's in effect. And automatic voter registration is pretty simple. You now have to proactively register to vote when you interact with a government office. Now, in those states, you are automatically registered to vote unless you opt out of it. So that's going to be interesting to watch. And then there are other states that have put restrictive processes in place. So Iowa set new regulations for voter registration drives and election day registration. Georgia codified the exact match policy into law. And then a law in Indiana this year gave officials the power to use Crosscheck, which is a program run by Chris Kobach in the state of Kansas that matches voter registration on only first name, last name, and date of birth against each other in states to try to identify double voters. It's horrible and has a very high rate of errors. And Indiana is trying to use that alone to initiate voter roll removal. They would not be able to do that alone. They'd have to go through a notification process, and there's some safeguards around that. But that would be the state that's using Crosscheck most sort of strongly. And then there are states that have opened up felon voting rights, which is interesting, and we expect to see some confusion from these voters because they can vote now, but some of these states, like Alabama, for example, have very restrictive voter registration policies, and so if you're talking about a voter who may never have participated in this type of process, we're still going to see some confusion there. And then these are the states that have had sort of racially or partisan gerrymandering cases come out of them, and so there are a lot of people who remain confused about what district they're in, we have learned. So Texas, you see the blue lit up again here. Very common state for all of these problems. So is Georgia, North Carolina. Those are 3 states that we're very concerned about this year, and we have sort of invested quite a lot of resources into covering. But that's all I have to say. So I think that we are going to move on to a discussion.
All right, we're really not sure how this was going to proceed, so we'll just sit up here and look like we're posing for a holiday picture or something.
Yeah.
One of the couple of things that Jessica said that I wanted to actually hang a little context on. The thing about North Dakota, I can tell you as someone who lived the first 19 years of my life in that state and who learned to drive and had to get a driver's license in North Dakota, particularly in the western part. Now I'm looking at the N and everything to the west, which is actually where I'm from. There are only 3 permanent DMV offices in the entire state. And if you look at the size geographically that we're talking about there, you are asking an awful lot. I mean, it's not like the East where you have one in just about every county or more. When I was a kid, there was a traveling circuit for the DMV, and they would come to little towns, but you had to know that it was like the first Tuesday of the month was the only time you could do anything like this. Now, I expect, oh, what happened? Can I get my map back? Thank you. I expect the biggest problem for this to be right about here, which is the Standing Rock Reservation, which if you have followed the news on the pipeline, it's the same reservation. There's a large population of Sioux Nation citizens there, and they don't have the street addresses. So to go to the DMV would be a drive of, I would estimate, about 60 miles to the Bismarck DMV. So in addition to the hour it's going to take them to get the PIN, they'd have to drive another hour, which sounds, I guess, okay until I tell you that vehicle ownership on that reservation, I would be amazed if it was anything close to ubiquitous, having been there. Folks live on that reservation in pretty harsh conditions, and so there's just no way that people are going to be able to fulfill that requirement, I don't think, and so I agree.
Yeah, no, I see that problem also in other parts of the country. So, for example, I spend a lot of time in Texas, covering voting issues in Texas, and I was just in a little town in LaSalle County, Texas, which is like on the border, about an hour in, sort of an hour north of the little tip of Texas, and it is a town of about 4,000 people that's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It is heavily Mexican-American. Most of the Mexican-Americans who live there have lived there since before Texas was Texas, and so they have some interesting, unique problems, and their closest DMV that issues new licenses or new IDs. So if you don't have one, you cannot get one in Cotulla. You have to go 67 miles south to Laredo or 62 miles west to San Antonio. Either way, even at Texas 85-mile-an-hour highway speeds is about an hour. And again, in that town, most of the people who don't have IDs live in what is called a colonia, which is a very impoverished neighborhood that has only spotty running water, so they certainly do not have a car. And so, these voter ID laws can actually stand directly in the way of turning out to vote. And in Texas, you can fill out a reasonable impediment declaration. So you would expect a place like LaSalle County, where the vast majority of people who live there are citizens and have always been, where the vast majority of people there are eligible to register to vote, to have high numbers of reasonable impediment declaration uses, because they certainly have a justifiable reason for not having an ID. But in the 2016 election, which was the first election and the first presidential election in which the voter ID law was in effect, there were 0 reasonable impediment declarations filed. And that's because in small towns and where you know your poll worker, you're going to be embarrassed to admit that you do not have an ID. And you're going to not want to fill out that form. And so you're going to see the language at the bottom that says you're filing this under penalty of perjury, and the consequence is that you've committed a felony, and you're going to walk right away. And you're going to say, oh, no, I left it at home, I'll come back and I'll fill this out. And then you just don't come back. And so that's the stakes that we're playing at. And so when people say to you that laws like this are racially neutral, they are on their face. But if you dig just 2 layers underneath that, you can see that the impact of it is incredibly disproportionate to people of color and to people who are of a very low socioeconomic status, especially the lowest. I mean, we're not talking about very large numbers of people. In the entire state of Texas, even the most generous estimates said that only 600,000 people would be impacted by this law and not have the type of ID. And 600,000 sounds like a large number, but we're talking about the state of Texas, right? So, but that's all skewed to one very specific segment of the population. And there's not a lot of fix for that right now in the law.
I think I want to back up just a bit so that we're all on the same page here. So this Texas voter ID law, when it was passed, as Jessica said, it was passed hours after the Shelby County decision came down. And Shelby County said, racism is now no longer a problem in election administration, and so states don't need federal government preclearance to change their laws anymore. And 2 hours later, Texas makes this policy change. Now there are six, right? 6 acceptable?
7.
7 acceptable forms of identification. You can do state ID, a state driver's license, a conceal and carry permit. Help me out.
Passport, naturalization papers, military certificate, and there's one other one, I think. Have we got to
Noticeably
7?
absent from the list is a student ID. Even student IDs issued by Texas state universities, by state officials. And so that, I think, is a signal about the priorities.
Right. Also notably absent from that is a native ID. And if you read the deposition paperwork for why that was not included, it's because the person who wrote that list couldn't figure out how many tribes there were in Texas because she couldn't figure out how to use Google. That is a true fact. So, yeah, I mean, there you go.
While Texas was doing this, North Carolina, we know, the North Carolina legislature was sending to its DMV an inquiry about the kinds of identification possessed by North Carolinians tabulated by race. And then its voter ID law reflected the whitest forms of identification. And in its decision, the circuit court said that the North Carolina legislature had targeted African American voters with, and I quote, almost surgical precision. So this is going on. And in Texas, what we're referring to on these declarations is a federal court order before the 2016 election said, all right, we believe that this is a racially based law and fails under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but it's so close to the election that we're not going to gut the law because the court will be resistant to changing the rules of an election while it's going on. So what they decided to do is let people who lacked this identification show up at the poll to vote as long as they signed a petition that said, I do not have an ID and here's why. So that's what that declaration is. Now, someone like me looks at that federal court ruling and just licks their chops. Because when that happens, one of the problems in political science is we have long suspected that these laws are racially disparate, but we've never been able to prove it. And so what the federal court gave us in Texas was a list of people who we could then tie to the voter file who lacked ID. So I got those petitions, and there are Barnard students in the room who went through them for the last year, who coded every bit of information from those petitions, and we are, with a co-author from Indiana University, just completing that analysis, and I can tell you a few tidbits of what we found. The population of voters who lacked ID in Texas in 2016 is significantly less white. than the population of voters who had it. And when we say less white, we have not finished our analysis. Our analysis is suggestive that there's effects for Hispanic voters, but we do have statistically significant results for African American voters. We also found that in 2014, when the law was fully in effect, that bucket of people who showed up without an ID were less likely to vote when they didn't have an identification, to the tune of about 10 percentage points. So it's what looks to us to be a big disenfranchising effect. But there's one thing that I don't even think I've told you that is we found to be really interesting in this. There's an assumption when we talk about voter ID and how it's disenfranchising. It's like the story that we've been telling. It's the people on the Native American reservation who, for whatever reason, never got the ID. Or one of the stories that's told in the South is African Americans especially were more likely to be born at home because they didn't have, back in the 40s, right? Because they didn't have access to medical facilities. So they didn't get birth certificates, so they could never get IDs. That's the kind of story that we tell. But what we actually find is that the most likely people to be disenfranchised are just people who moved. People who, for whatever reason, their address doesn't match where their voting card says they should match. And so a different kind of story also emerges, and we think with that knowledge, if we go to state legislators and say, well, you're hurting the people that we think you probably want to hurt, but you're also hurting a lot of voters who you don't want to hurt, that might be the way forward.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, we see just sort of, like our data is not sort of statistically as like robust as you might want for a data analysis, but anecdotally we see across the country that quite a lot of the confusion and quite a lot of the problems that are called in to 888-OUR-VOTE, which we see all the time, are just people who have moved and don't know where they're supposed to register, have missed the registration deadline, or, you know, in a lot of circumstances they will have moved and are no longer eligible to vote in the previous state because they don't have an address there anymore, but have not established residency in a new state for long enough to register to vote there either. And so it just becomes kind of a circular problem of disenfranchisement when you move. Thing people do multiple times in their life. So
the big problem here, it just always comes back to Shelby. But I think it's been good for business for both of us, having to keep up with all of the things that you have to keep up with. You know, this state changes that law. Well, how many people will be thrown off the rolls? And these are questions that we both think about every day in different ways.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely a problem. It's definitely a problem from a perception standpoint. I think that people perceiving that they will be disenfranchised is just as damaging as the law actually doing that to them, which is something that you see a lot. And, you know, when I go to ProPublica and I say, hey, can I hire 15 temporary employees for the election to cover this stuff? And they're like, yes, then you know that it's actually a problem. Otherwise, they wouldn't give me any money. So it's a problem. I mean, it's frustrating to see, because I think on one hand, it is frustrating for the people who are experiencing it, and it's frustrating for me as a reporter who's trying to process this data and push it out in a way that is truthful and accurate and not exaggerating of the problem to local reporters, to see activist groups exaggerate the effects of them, because that exaggeration has a huge disenfranchising effect and leads people to believe that their vote does not matter and that their vote is not cared about. And I cannot state to you, given the guffaws in the room, I'm just going to assess that y'all are left of center, that like progressive activist groups disenfranchise people all the time. And we should be very wary of overstating the impact of these laws and not clearly communicating the remedies when we talk about the harms, because most people will only read the headline, most people will only read the first two paragraphs of the story. So if your story is 50,000 people are no longer on the rolls in Georgia, and your story is not 50,000 people are no longer on the rolls in Georgia, but they can still vote, then those 50,000 people don't show up. Otherwise, they certainly would. So we need to think about messaging just as much as we think about the laws themselves. And if we don't, then we miss thousands of people.
And that's why journalism is so important right now. Journalism is more important to the political health of this country in this moment right now than it has ever been in our lifetime. And so many things are changing with respect to the machinery of democracy that we need people to keep us abreast of this. And this is a conversation that we political scientists are having as well. There's a strong norm in our field to stand askance of politics and to not wade into political questions, and there's a conversation among us that if not us, then who will do this? And I have personally decided that if I have to die on the hill of voting rights in Texas, then so be it. That's what I'll do. That's an example of using all of the training and investments that this country has made in me to be part of that conversation. And if I have to send letters to the federal court in Kansas on the case you were covering.
You did do that.
Yeah, we could.
Okay. Oh, goodness.
Then we'll do that too. And so I think all fields are engaging these problems in their own way. Are you wanting to move us to questions? Yeah, in a few minutes. Oh, I think the audience wants to move to questions.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so I think I'm moderating, so go ahead.
The last time you spoke to us, one of the last questions you got was about hacking. And you said that was probably the most interesting question that you were asked. And you gave about 10 minutes to us on what you knew about it and what you had observed about it. And I'd like to hear some more about that.
So did everyone hear the question? Oh, okay. The question was about hacking and what I think about hacking. I think several things about hacking. We all think thoughts about alleged Russian hacking in the election. Well, it's not alleged, right? We think thoughts about Russian hacking in 2016. Here's what I say back to students. Students blame the outcome of the result on the Russians, and I say it's not the Russians, it's us. It's us. We are in a moment where we have to look very critically at the role of social media in our lives, and I have come personally myself to see it as a nefarious force, used more often for negative reasons than good ones. How many of us have uncritically forwarded a meme that we saw on Facebook? If you have done that, then you are the Russians. Because the Russians knew that we would do that and turned us against ourselves in that way. And so what we need to do to combat that kind of hacking is to become more critical and more self-aware about the problem, more willing to go and vet the information. Now, Facebook has done probably all they can do to try to show us the sources on that, but it's probably still not enough. So the best thing you can do is close your Facebook account. That's what I have done. So the follow-up question is, the real threat about hacking is, what do I think about the hacking of election machines? It remains a problem. So one thing that I like to do when I vote in New Jersey, where I live, I do this every election. Every election I go into the polling place and I close the curtain and I cast my vote on machines. Now, New Jersey folks in the room, you know this is true, right? You go and you do that and you push the buttons and it beeps at you and says thank you very much, and you leave. And I leave that polling place having voted on an electronic machine that's given me no assurance that it's actually logged my vote. And I go to the little old lady sitting outside of it and I say, can I get my receipt? That's my singular act of protest every election. I ask for my receipt. Because on the New Jersey Turnpike, I can get a receipt when I buy gas in the middle of the night. Why can't I get a receipt for my vote? This literally keeps me up at night. I don't know what the larger threat in New Jersey is the gradually failing Hudson River Tunnel or electronic voting in New Jersey, because you have to trust that your vote is correctly counted on that machine, correctly transmitted to the central precinct computer, and correctly tabulated in the precinct and sent to Trenton. Now, I'm not saying that people are trying to hack the vote, but what I am saying is I have personally observed, and I know you have as well, an awful lot of incompetence when it comes to the administration of American elections. So give me a receipt. Give me a paper copy that I can put in the ballot box, so if the wheels do fall off of an election, I can say, count every ballot. In the state of New Jersey, count every ballot means, yep, that's what the machine said. And it is only a matter of time, ladies and gentlemen, before we have a constitutional crisis that results from election machines that give no paper trail.
I would like to add to this just very quickly. So I talk to people about, so first of all, I would just like to say that in my newsroom, I have banned people from writing the word hack into stories. It is not a specific word. Everybody thinks that they know what it means, and everybody thinks that it means a different thing. There are more specific words like breach, scan, manipulation, penetration. All of those things are more specific. All of them have a specific definition. The word hack doesn't mean anything. There is, as yet, no evidence at all that the voting machines were hacked, that the machines themselves were hacked. It would be very difficult to do that in American elections. There are more than 10,000 unique jurisdictions for voting in the United States, and they all use a different type of machine. They don't count them in the same way. The election is so diffuse that it would be very difficult to manipulate an election from a voting perspective at scale. It is not difficult to make you think that the votes have been hacked at scale. So when we talk about threat models, like even the people who are hardline, our voting machines are deeply insecure, do not believe that the threat model is a mass literal hack of the machines. They believe that it is a misinformation campaign driven around the possibility of hacking the machines. And so I think that it is always very important for people to not use the word hack and for them to use something that is much more specific that gets at exactly the question that you're trying to ask. And so if the question is, were the machines themselves manipulated? I think that the answer to that question is no. I think that the much easier thing to do is to access voter registration systems, right? Which you can't really manipulate on election day because they're generally air-gapped, right? If you got in on election day and you changed all the voter registration and sent people to the wrong polling places or something like that, there would be fixes for that on the day of the election that I think our election administrators are capable enough of carrying out in the moment. And many of those problems have been shored up since 2016. I think election administrators have realized in 2016 that election security is a real problem, and I've seen them do momentous work pushing themselves forward. That said, though, we just did a survey of the 30 most tightly contested congressional races, and I think only half of the people in those offices had two-factor authentication on their email. So that wasn't great. And so that wouldn't affect votes, that wouldn't affect the tally, but it could impact the strength in our conviction that the election is correct. So like think about this, for example, right? Would it matter if they actually affected the results at all if they took down the AP's live vote result tally on election night and made those numbers not match the returns that were coming in, right? What would people think? Would they think, oh, the AP's been hacked, no big deal, or would they think somebody's screwing with our results? I think that they would think the latter. So misinformation campaigns are easy. Actually hacking our election campaign is not easy. And I think that we as Americans need to think critically about the rumors we choose to spread, because those are much more dangerous than an actual hacking campaign.
Yeah, and to clarify, I also am not terribly concerned about external hacking, but what I am concerned about is an election in New Jersey being too close to call.
Truly.
And then
yes.
this type of campaign comes in where people are, alleged. And I will add to what Jessica said that one of the dirty secrets of American election administration is, as far as I'm aware, the most common operating system that runs our election machines is Windows XP. That is a true fact.
First, I wanted to thank you, because awareness is absolutely the first step in identifying a problem. But the issues you bring up, I don't come from a political background, but a business one, in technology and product development. And it seems as though there's sufficient background, history, information for someone to think of perhaps a solution or a better way of voter registration, validation of identity. There's blockchain that's, I guess, in the front edge of financial services and ensuring that transactions are authenticated. Do you know of any organizations, or have we reached out to maybe these experts in trying to figure out a solution for this problem?
Yeah, so I think the concept of blockchain in voting is flawed for a lot of reasons. Given the way that blockchain works, it's very difficult to protect anonymous ballots if you do something like that. So I don't think that that will ever be a solution, and I think that it will not be a solution because technologically it doesn't make sense, but also because we're talking about election administrators who operate on the same budget line as like a Parks and Recreation department. So like, I just want to make very clear to everyone in this room that elections are not administered at a federal level, they are administered at a county level, which means that in order to create a solution, you're actually having to create 10,000 different solutions and not one national solution. And election administrators, for good reasons and bad reasons, have been incredibly wary of federal intervention in elections. I mean, even giving them money to shore up their own systems is controversial. So, and also, you know, the last huge federal involvement in election administration was the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which gave hundreds of millions of dollars to local jurisdictions to purchase new machines and to shore up their technology. That also means that the last time most places bought voting machines was in 2002.
It's Windows XP.
Windows XP, right? And before the first iPhone, right? So like, we're talking about touchscreen machines that like need to be recalibrated. Like, I don't know if any of you had a Palm Pilot where like the dots would pop up and you'd have to be like, this is the dot and this is the dot and this, and like calibrate the screen that way. That's how your voting machines work. And so when people have problems with voting machines, they assume they're hacks. They're actually just the voting machines breaking. So the solution is money, right? The problem is that that money is not coming from the federal level, it's coming from the county level. And in the minds of counties that are already strapped budget-wise, they're like, okay, do we fill these potholes or do we give our county new voting machines even though we only use the voting machines once every 2 years? And I don't know that I know what the right answer to that question is, right? Like, sure, yes, voting is incredibly important and it's like the underpinnings of our democracy, right? And maybe we need to think about more sustainable long-term solutions that aren't so technologically driven for voting, I'm not sure. But what we're talking about is like really like the financing of elections on a very local level. And federal solutions are only actually a solution if those solutions are promised every few years to re-up and not in 2002, and then when everything goes to pot in 2016, we think about it again, right? That's not really a solution. So it has to be at a local level, and that's very difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and there's a genuine crisis brewing when it comes to this, and it will only be after the
It
next
will only be after the
catastrophic
disaster.
election.
That it gets fixed. Because that's why the Help America Vote Act of 2002 was passed, right? Everybody remembers the 2000 election, how much of a disaster it was from an administration perspective, and how bananas it is that an entire presidential election came down to some hanging chads, right? That is when we will get the next federal installment of money, and I don't think that that disaster was 2016. Because from an election administration standpoint, 2016 was actually the best administered election this country has ever seen. There were other issues that had nothing to do with election administration, but from an administration standpoint, it was very well done.
My answer is that we should become less fixated on more technology and run elections like it's 1845. The lowest error percentage, including electronic voting, the lowest error percentage we see is optical scan paper ballots, like a multiple choice test. This is how Minnesota does it. Minnesota has the lowest error rate of voting in America. They still get their election results out in a timely fashion. They feed them in the paper scans. And when the wheels fall off of the election, like it did, in what year was that, 2010 with the Norm Coleman recount, they had paper to go and recount. That's why we can make fun of Minnesotans for writing lizard people on their ballot, because they had one. We can't write lizard people in New Jersey, and that scares me.
I'm curious, in the beginning you mentioned about the reporters, that the information is getting to you and then you can send reporters. I was going to say, does it do any good? Is there enough time to make any changes if there are problems when they're
Oh, certainly,
seen?
yeah. I mean,
Oh.
I think especially now that early voting is so common, we see the majority of election administration problems will happen early in early voting, which means that there actually is quite a lot of time for those problems to be fixed. But even on the election day, I think something that people don't know or appreciate about election administration is that there are like fail-safes for most the vast majority of problems that will occur on election day in the majority of polling places. So if this happens, and poll workers can do this. If this happens, and poll workers can do this. If everything goes totally awry, then there's an emergency van that will drive to the polling place and like deal with it. So there are solutions that can be implemented very quickly on election day, and poll workers are generally prepared to implement those solutions. The problem is that poll workers sort of operate in isolation, and so often it is not obvious to the central office that there is a problem with a polling location until it's too late. So where we come in is we can make them aware of that problem very quickly, and then they can implement those problems. So for example, in 2016, there was a poll worker, just some random rogue poll worker in Travis County, Texas, that was making all of the people who wanted to fill out a reasonable impediment declaration cast a provisional ballot instead of a regular ballot, which was not the law, and putting them in a different line to do that. Well, we found out about that very quickly. Travis County dispatched an emergency van, replaced the poll worker in like 90 minutes. So it can be fixed. There is enough time. Where it becomes more difficult, and this is, I'm just going to say this flat out because this is factually accurate, it is more difficult to vote in New York State than it is in Texas. It is more difficult to vote in New York State than it is in Georgia. It is more difficult to vote in New York State than it is in South Carolina. That is because in New York you can only vote in one precinct on one day, and if you're out of town, too bad, right? I, for example, am a registered voter in the state of New York. I will not be able to vote on election day because I cannot attest under penalty of perjury that I will be out of the county because I will be working all day from 6 a.m. to midnight, and I cannot leave. So I cannot vote. I have been disenfranchised by this state. So if I was in Texas, I could vote over a 3-week period at any polling location in Dallas County because they have vote centers, and I would have lots of options, right? So depending on what you think easy means, right? New York is one of the hardest states to vote, and also New York doesn't set up their polling places until the morning of the election. So for example, we saw a bunch of people disenfranchised in Brooklyn last year because their polling location didn't have any pins, and then they left and went to work and did not come back. So there's not any time to fix those problems, and it's especially problematic in states that don't have early voting and that set up their polling locations on election day. There's not much we can do about it.
On our side of things, I'm not involved with this, but I'm aware of 2 independent teams of political scientists who are developing a similar thing to this. And the method there is to keep querying the Twitter API. And what they're doing is crawling Twitter constantly during the election, looking for people who tweet about an election problem, and then building out some kind of network to map where that precinct is likely to be, which we can then, in theory, feed to a desk like this one or develop something to raise the alarm.
We try to do some things like that. We have these really long Boolean phrases that are we have grad students constantly refreshing in Twitter on election day, and the problem is that you oversee problems in places where people tweet. So if you were looking at the New York primary, you would assume that the vast majority of election administration problems were in Brooklyn, not because they were actually in Brooklyn, just because a lot of people in Brooklyn are on Twitter. So you can adjust for that, and if you know that, there are things that you can do to mitigate those false positives, but there you go.
I had an interesting experience. I wanted to vote in the primary. I don't need you to louder enough. I wanted to vote in the primary, and I came there, and they had no record of my name. I said, I'm here, and I want to vote. The 2 people sitting at the desk had no clue, but there was another woman there. She came over with an envelope. She said, you can fill out an affidavit, and you can vote. I think some of it is training, because had she not been there, I absolutely would not have been able to vote in the primary.
Have you checked to see if your affidavit ballot counted? Did it count? Okay.
They just sent me a card saying, I'm perfectly registered. So it occurred to me that they have to have good people in the voting areas to be able to solve these problems immediately.
They do.
But that comes back to money, right? That's the point about money.
I have one other question. If the House turns this year, will that help things at all?
No.
Do you want me to tell you what you want to hear, or do you want the actual answer? This is a difficult question. If the House turns, Democrats find themselves in a precarious position because, now, is it possible that they also have the Senate? Yes. It's possible. Anything is possible. It's not likely, but it is certainly possible. But they're not going to have 2/3. So even if you really think that the president has committed an impeachable offense, you've read the New York Times thing, you find warrant there for impeachment, 1998 needs to be a lesson that Democrats take to heart here. I do not think you defeat this president in the United States Congress. I think you defeat him on the Electoral College map. And that needs to be what the Democrats come down on. If they push too hard in investigation, I think it will backfire. And I think it will backfire in the places that he won in 2016. We have to be careful living in New York to assume that folks in North Dakota or Minnesota or Michigan see it the same way, right? And I think that's a real risk. I think it's a risk. That's not to say that Democrats should not use their investigation power if they believe but there's got to be a balance, because you're not going to get the 2/3 that you need to impeach, would be my question there.
I'd like to ask a question. Could you comment on the impact, if any, of get out to vote? That was spoken about getting out to vote. Is it a factor, isn't it a factor in your review and your...
I mean, I think that yes, so he's asked about the impact of get out the vote. Maybe you can speak more to this. I mean, it's kind of hard to say. Like, there's a difference between registering to vote and actually voting. So, you know, we're seeing actually like a surge of registration. So I was on the phone today, for example, with Travis County, Texas, which is where Austin is, and they told me that on the last day of voter registration eligibility in that county, there were more applications than there were on the last day before 2016, and you would expect not to see that. There was something like 10,000 more. So it could, I mean, I don't know, to answer your question. I think some voter turnout drives are really effective, some are not, and the differences and similarities between those two things are often hard to measure.
As a political scientist, I will say it's the only thing that matters. Get out the vote is the only thing that matters. Every election is a question of mobilization. Now, the media have lied to you. Most Americans have sold this, have swallowed the hook on this, that there is 1/3 of us are Democrats, 1/3 of us are independents, and 1/3 of us are the squishy independents who decide the election. And we go home and we read the paper and waffle back and forth between Clinton and Trump, or the Democrat and the Republican in the midterm. Does anyone know anyone for whom that is true? That story does not hold. What is actually true is that the 1/3 of Americans who say they're independents to pollsters are liars. They are reliable partisans. They tell pollsters they're independent, but when we ask them who they voted for in the last 6 presidential elections, it's a Democrat. So they behave in just the same way that a Democrat is, and elections are not waged based on that, based on preference and decision. There's no waffling. So if you accept that as true, then every election is a ground game, get out the vote election. So my field has been on this now for 20 years, and the most replicated finding in all of political science is this: the way to win an election is to knock on doors. Face-to-face, high-quality personal interaction. We have a conversation. I don't force a message on you. I'm not micro-targeting. I get from you what you want. What's your issue? Well, here's how my candidate feels about that. That has a massive effect in terms of turnout. It has a lot of other secondary effects too. There's a lesser effect for mail, a lesser effect for phone, but those things matter as well. What doesn't matter at all are robocalls. You run a congressional campaign, you have robocalls, you might as well just light a pile of money on fire because it's not working. And all of the emails, none of that works. But shoe leather, again, run elections like it's 1845. If you remember one thing from tonight, it's that. Vote like it's 1845, mobilize people like it's 1845, face-to-face, low-tech. And everything that we're wired as Americans runs contrary to that. But I can show you more than 100 articles that suggest that what I just said is true.
But people are taking advantage of this, right? So people are drawing districts in which it makes it really difficult to go door to door and knock on the doors. So the South Texas town that I told you I was in is in a congressional district that takes 10 hours to drive across. And no one has ever gone door to door in LaSalle County, Texas on a congressional level, because who can walk that much distance. Even if you mobilize a wonderful ground campaign with lots of volunteers at such a big distance that it makes it difficult to do these traditional things that get people excited and turn out. And so you turn to other things that are just not as effective, and then you're lost.
And not every race can be won. That's because of the way that some districts are drawn. Sometimes it's just a 70 percentage point difference between candidates, so we have to remember that. But in winnable races, if you spend $1 million running against my 250,000, you spend it all on TV, and I spend mine on shoe leather and volunteers, I'm gonna beat you. And the evidence for that is right over in the Bronx. And on that, I think I have to end this. I'm getting the strong hook signal, so.
So just some quick closing remarks. I'm Victoria Gordon. I'm the acting director of the Athena Center. Can we just have one last round of applause for our speakers? We have some gifts here for you. Can we also have a big round of applause for the Office of Alumni Relations and the Project Continuum team? If you all enjoyed tonight as much as I know I did, we hope you'll join us tomorrow night for a conversation from the Faculty Lounge on power and political networking. Also, shameless plug for the Athena Film Festival, which will be held February 28th through March 3rd. Visit barnard.edu/events to find out more and to register. And thank you all again for coming.